Please come in. I apologize for overstepping my rank in such an insolent way, Lord Arius. I should be the one coming to visit you, but there's no need to explain yourself, Commander Tress. I know some people are not well suited to sea voyages. Mr. Storm is the perfect example, even with his snorting powders. And your people are known to fare even worse, so don't worry about it, especially considering all that you've done for this expedition during these past months. Unfortunately, after I gave it some thought, I feel like my contributions don't matter too much, and this is precisely what I wanted to talk with you about. Let's recap. Over the past month, we were attacked 4 times by mercenaries sent from Metzacan. First time, we were aware of them. We saw their ship approaching, and were able to prepare ourselves to repel them. But other 3 attacks are far more concerning, for every time enemy forces simply emerge from below decks of our own ships, as if they were there since the very start of our journey. Obviously, after first attack from inside like that happened, we searched every vessel from top to bottom and found nothing. But it didn't stop another 2 of such attacks to happen later anyway. I'm sure you see how concerning this is. Indeed, and I've been thinking on it as well, though, to be honest, I was running blank until a few hours ago. I remembered one of the projects that Arcadian showed me some time ago, back when we were resting between campaigns in Metzacan. It was like a cross between one of his tanks and galleons, a metallic, fish-like creation that could not only sail on the waves but also below them. He never mentioned following through with this design, but is it possible that he finished a prototype of such underwater vessel while he was still alive? No, he did not, and I doubt that anyone from Colonial Artificers would be smart enough to work it out just from his blueprints in such a short amount of time. I saw these designs a few times, and they were extremely complicated, though I managed to pick up some smaller things there that I already used to make our current ships a bit faster. I noticed. You have my thanks for that, Commander Tress. But on that note, were you working close with Arcadian? I know he usually was reluctant to show other people his designs unless he was really sure they could be made. They ridiculed him about being over-ambitions back home, after all. He showed them to me, but I think it was mostly to make a point. As I said, I was the very first of my people to join Artificers Guild, and many of their number instantly discarded me as some backward savage who could contribute nothing to their organization. Master Arcadian saw that and took me in as a personal apprentice, showing me some of his blueprints and ensuring that I was up to speed with latest designs. That's Arcadian for you. But if he decided to spend his time teaching you, then you clearly must have some potential, or a lot of practical knowledge. He always had an eye for talent. It is not for me to say, but I feel like I managed to contribute to some of colonial designs over the past year or so. For example, most of the navigation tools that are used on our airships are my invention. But please excuse my bragging, Lord Arius. This is not the reason why I called you here. As mentioned, I was thinking about these attacks on our expedition, and since Arcadian's underwater ship is clearly not the culprit here, I wondered who or what else could transport these mercenaries directly onto our ships. And if I have to be honest, it does not look good. I ran every scenario I could think on in my head, but they all point to one thing: magic. Transportation spells are possible, but they require immense amounts of magical energy and level of knowledge only available to wisest and most experienced sorcerers. And I'm sorry to say, but there are only 2 such people here. Mr. Storm and Galadea. I see. And though I want this to stay between us, I've been thinking the same thing ever since the first attack, though obviously I don't have any proof. I was never good with magic, so it's very much out of my league, but you are forgetting about something. There is another person with us that possesses powerful magical abilities, Zabalus, or whatever the hell is left of it right now. Its abilities are undefined and it clearly tries to hide as much as possible from us, but we can't let our guard down around this thing, especially since we don't know what its true plan really is. You're right. It says that it wants to leave this world, but then again it's clearly not a material being. It just inhabits that cloud of shadows that Zabalus was before, so why can't it just leave or inhabit some other body far away from here? But that's beside the point. You mentioned something really interesting there, the fact that you have no magical abilities. It is the same for me and for my people, and for the treacherous dwarfs. With that in mind, I've ordered my men to observe Zabulus, and I noticed that it mostly hangs around your two magical companions. It may be harmless, or it may be that it tries to affect them somehow. You think it controls them in some way? But no, that makes no sense. It said it wants to leave the world, so why would it give us coordinates of that starship just to sabotage our journey there? I don't know. I'm exploring all available options. Besides, do not forget that Zabulus is just a mouthpiece for this shroud thing right now, and is apparently an entity so terrifying that these Commonwealth people were willing to kill themselves and, indirectly, us, just to prevent it from leaving. So we should keep an eye on it all the time anyway. But, if I may be honest, I still think one of your companions is the most probable suspect. Not Galadea, that's for sure. Aside from a little company, she has no place left to go in the world. But suspecting Mr. Storm is equally pointless. He was always a loyal friend and mentor. Maybe he still is. Maybe he thinks that this expedition won't help us, but he also knows he won't convince you with just words, so he tries to get some mercenaries to bring you home by force. Maybe. But no, this also makes no sense. If he has a means of transporting people onto the ships, he could also transport them out and could have taken me away dozens of times by now. But then again, mercenaries appearing from below decks in the middle of the sea also makes no sense. What is even going on here? I don't know, Lord Arius, which is why I'm so unnerved by this situation. But one thing I know for sure, there is an enemy amongst us, and if we want to save our people, then we'll have to find them and deal with them before their misguided actions kill us all. It was an early summer day of year 1145 when inhabitants of Metzacan woke up and saw snow falling outside their windows. It was just a few flakes, and they melted minutes after reaching the ground, but the fact that they appeared in a time when the city usually became unbearably hot convinced almost everyone that their situation was worse than they expected. And though there would be no snow for the rest of the summer, that single instance caused a dramatic shift in society that now almost completely turned its attention towards Caerdon Plan. Some, of course, still claim that it was nothing but a bunch of random coincidences, but when these visual reports were paired with information from other continents, they all painted a very grim picture, and so Governor Gerstein soon found himself managing entire lines of volunteers eager to help with his plan. Slowly but surely, general public forgot about their deposed, exiled leader Lord Arius, but Metzacan government did not. Over the past month, Prince's expedition was constantly hounded by mercenaries hired by Gerstein, who suspected that Arius could still pose a threat to his underground evacuation plan. And while so far all of these mercenaries were repelled, the way they conducted their attacks caused a lot of confusion amongst Prince's expedition and sowed a seed of mistrust between its members. For while the first attack simply came from another warship that charged at the expedition in hopes of boarding them, other ones were decidedly more devious. Groups of hired warriors simply appeared on board of expedition's ships, seemingly out of nowhere, and struck in the middle of the night when no one expected them. And though most of these attacks were repelled without much issue, for Lord Erigen's company was composed of veterans of many fights, they still caused some casualties. But what's more, it caused members of the expedition to look at each other with distrust, especially at those who possessed magical skills that enabled them to transport people over long distances. After all, there was no logical explanation for these mercs to simply show up below decks, and so someone had to bring them on board. And while at first other options like underwater ships were considered, after fifth such attack, attention turned firmly to people like Mr. Storm and his students and Galadea Pireni, who found themselves under constant observation by their fellow comrades, no matter how much Arius vouched for them. and even though he did, it was clear to everyone on board of these ships that the prince was not sure either, and with every day he distanced himself from the company of those he, not so long ago, considered his loyal friends and allies, and began spending most of the time alone in his cabin, while morale of his group withered with every day spent on the sea. But despite that, the voyage continued and no one really voiced their concerns openly, for everyone knew that their mission was far more important than any personal grudge, whether real or imagined one. But some also quietly pondered if the safety of said mission wasn't in danger, and so the further the ships sailed away from Metzaca, the more their crews started watching each other with increasing fear and paranoia. Meanwhile, back in the south, General Vestron's pacification of former Emerald colonies came to an end. Some of the settlements remained independent for now, but at the very least peaceful relations with them were secured, and so, after receiving all clear from the General, colonial administration started moving more and more people south to use scorching hot volcanic islands as safe staging ground for their evacuation. But even though Metzacan army dealt with former Elven lands, their job was still far from over, thanks to declaration of war that came both from Goblin and Southern colonies. As it turned out, these two nations decided that they should be in charge of Caedon Caves, which they clearly considered to be their one and only salvation at this point, and were willing to use any means, including brute force, to dislodge Metzacans from there and take control themselves. Obviously, Governor Gerstein was not willing to submit and started preparing countermeasures as soon as he learned about those declarations. Caedon was not just going to become largest haven for refugees in the world, it was also to become the greatest, most defensible bastion in the world, a fortress that would keep people down in the caves safe from being forcibly evicted by someone else. But General Vestrund, while technically in favor of this plan, had an idea of his own. Instead of waiting for his enemies to come to him, he would take his forces further west, deep into territory of Goblin republics, which were designated as the most dangerous threat, and cause as much chaos as possible there in hopes of drawing attention towards him instead of Caedon. It was, as many expected, a one-way trip, for no one knew just how strong the republics actually were, and even if Brimir was able to defeat them, if he would be able to return home in time. But even with that grim scenario in mind, soldiers of Metzaca were determined to follow their general no matter what, for by doing so, they ensured safety of their friends and loved ones back home, something that every soldier could take pride and comfort in. And so, mere weeks after city of Draconian warriors was pacified, Metzacan forces departed west towards their first objective, an island inhabited by Tigrans living under banners of Goblin republics. It was, as it turned out, yet another tribe that left their homeland in the southeast, but while their numbers were greater than the clans of Kuzanel Sidiu, they were a lot less warlike than their northern kin, and so, when goblins showed up, the tribe simply surrendered to them without a fight, something that was evident by the fact that the city, while inhabited by cat people, was defended almost exclusively by goblin soldiers, led by a mercenary dwarven commander. Placed on top of a steep hill that forced attackers to attack only from one side, and with garrison of around 500 soldiers supported by some elementals summoned by goblin sorcerers, the city was a surprisingly tough nut to crack, especially since its commander prepared for the attackers by setting an entire perimeter outside of the wall on fire using oil, forcing any would-be assault to rush through the raging flames. But of course that tactic, while certainly ingenious and smart, wasn't going to work against Metzacans who, shortly after arriving, simply deployed their cannons and began pounding the walls, forcing the defenders to either abandon them and flee deeper into the city, or to sally out and come to them. For first few days though, the defenders stood bravely, and despite artillery battering down their wooden walls, managed to hold on their position. But then, after 6 days of siege, perhaps after realizing that no reinforcements were coming, the garrison decided to gamble and rushed out to try to either take Metzacans out or simply to fight their way through them and escape. At this point though, forces of General Brimir were used to such operations, and as soon as the gates were opened and garrisons started charging out through their own flaming traps, the besiegers were ready and moved in to intercept, bringing their numerical and technological superiority to bear against their foes. And while the result of this sally was obvious from the start, goblins still managed to take Brimir's troops by surprise with their sheer determined ferocity. They charged out of the gates so fast and with such fury that Vestron's cavalry that was sent to intercept them was simply swept away, and only a handful of dwarven and human riders managed to escape approaching foes. But as said foes moved further away from their walls, they became perfect targets for artillery, and within the next hour, the entire garrison was wiped out. Not a single goblin soldier managed to flee, and only a handful returned to the city, but at this point they were no longer able to do anything, and simply surrendered few hours later as their gates disappeared in massive explosions. Another city was conquered, but this time it was not going to be just a simple addition to Metzacan. By now, General Vestrand knew that this island, just like the one inhabited by Draconians, was very warm and surprisingly fertile, and so offered a perfect place for northern Metzacan refugees, whose number grew with every passing day. With that in mind, local Tigrans were not treated well. As soon as their garrison laid down their arms, Brimir ordered all of the cat people to be rounded up and gathered outside of the walls. The process took few days, but in the end the entire population of the city was gathered in one place, where they received an offer they could not refuse. And that offer was simple: leave. The Tigrans were to flee the island and go wherever they wished, just as long as that wasn't southern Metzacan. They could try and look for luck among other tribes of Kuzan and Sidiu, or they could go somewhere else. Brimir did not really care, for this place was to become yet another settlement made specifically for the refugees, waiting for their passage to Caerdon. Of course, the Tigrans were not pleased with such an offer, but under steel mechanical gaze of tanks and cannons, they could only accept it or die, and so the entire tribe, with barely any possessions, including food or water, marched out to the shore, where Metzacans provided them with a handful of old cargo ships, though not nearly enough for everyone. As expected, some of the cat people tried to venture north and, eventually, reached settlements of their kin, but a significant number simply returned to goblin territories and were never seen again. Once news of such treatment reached Metzacan Tigrans, their representatives were understandably outraged, but Governor Gerstein simply stated that at this point, all sacrifices were justified to ensure safety of Caerdon Plan. It was enough for the protests to stop, and so Gerstein returned to work, unaware that his cat-like subjects were already working on another plan with Prince Arius. But while those living outside of Metzacan borders could no longer hope for any preferential treatment, those who worked for Gerstein could, depending on their usefulness. And one such group that proved to be surprisingly more useful than anyone expected were the freshly subjugated Draconians. At first, they were confused and directionless, but as soon as Metzacan governors arrived with supplies and advice, the dragon-like people turned out to be surprisingly hard-working race, so eager to have direction again that they were willing to work day and night just as thanks for having stability and order in their lives again. Within a mere few months of their subjugation, their cities were rebuilt and reorganized, and Draconian working castes moved to the fields to prepare them for incoming waves of refugees. More impressively though, some of the workers even managed to walk through their docile nature and offer their service to Metzacan army. Their skills, as expected, were nothing special though, and their morale was practically non-existent, but still they brought a surprising advantage to the table, one that General Vestrand, who lost some troops in the past few months, was more than eager to utilize. As it happened, Draconians had one more trick, in form of herds of tamed raptor-like lizards that served as their beasts of burden and mounts. Far more aggressive and ferocious than their riders, these raptors could easily be used as cavalry, something that Dwarven commander learned with uncontained joy, though when he realized that there were no warrior Draconians left and the walkers were terrified of combat, he had to make some adjustments to his plans, and instead of creating vicious raptor shock cavalry, he organized 2 companies of the so-called Thunder Braves, who were basically mounted Draconian gunners. Lizard people turn out to be surprisingly eager to learn usage of the firearms, but with their low morale, using them as regular musketeers wasn't exactly an option, so instead Brimir created this new brand of mounted gunners who could bombard enemies from afar, and then flee if any would come close to them. And even if someone managed to catch up, they would first have to deal with raptors themselves who, as mentioned, were a lot less pacifistic than their walk-cast riders. And so, under watchful eye of Metzacan officers, first companies of Draconian Thunder Braves began their training, and while, realistically speaking, they were nothing special, the very sight of lizards with guns riding into battle on even larger and much angrier lizards was a sight that would put fear into the heart of any opponent, and General Vestrand was giddy with excitement to use this new shock company in the field. And so, on both ends of the archipelago, commands from Metzaca walked to save their people. But while General Vestrand had official backing of the colony and could count on help, Arius and his company were all on their own, something that, as they would learn soon enough, would cause them some troubles. One of such issues was of course isolation from any information from back home, and so as Prince's expedition sailed further west, into areas controlled by Goblin republics, they had no idea that they were moving into hostile territory. Initially, Arius wished to negotiate passage with the goblins, but his plan was quickly dismantled by the very first goblin ship they encountered. A small patrol cutter, armed with a single cannon, spotted the expedition and opened fire, hoping to lure them into pursuit. It was a standard naval strategy for goblins: offer a weak but fast target to their enemies and force a favorable chase. What these small greenskins did not expect, though, was that former prince had a number of flying soldiers on his side, and, after a quick raid led by Mr. Storm and Galadea, Goblin ship had no choice but to surrender. And it was there when Arius finally learned of the complete collapse of worldwide diplomacy and the war that now encompassed the entire archipelago. But while these revelations were certainly troubling, they were overshadowed by far more pressing matter. Turns out, Goblin colonies were aware of Arius' expedition and believed it was an invasion force, and so they sent their own army to stop them, and said force was already sailing full speed towards Prince's handful of vessels. What's more, goblins were prepared so well that another fleet was also sent around the island to the north, and was currently moving to cut off any escape routes, and no matter how much the fallen prince tried to explain that he was no longer part of Metzaca, it was clear that the battle was inevitable, and it certainly did not look like an easy one. Some of the flying scouts were sent ahead, and when they came back, only about half of them, they brought with them concerning news. For the goblins brought with them not only about a dozen of warships, their fleet was also led by a looming, massive creature, black as night, flying above the ships. Description of said creature left nothing to the imagination. That thing was a dragon, somehow tamed by Republican forces and brought to battle as a living weapon. All of a sudden, all mistrust between members of the expedition evaporated as the prince addressed his people and told them about upcoming fight, for if they wished to reach their destination, this confrontation was inevitable. Still, even though this rallying speech roused his men, they still looked to the horizon with uncertainty, fully aware of numerical superiority of their foes. But it was there when Commander Tress Hackwrench proved their worth once again. Together with her men, she rushed below decks and brought up dozens of crates up, and over the next 2 days, she walked without a break to assemble an entire cloud of drones that, while obviously not powerful, could still be used as a suicidal distraction in battle. and such reinforcements were most certainly needed, for mere hours after she finished her work, a goblin fleet appeared on the horizon, approaching from both front and back, and as they did so, Metzacan realized to their utter shock that their foes actually had 2 dragons on their side. Without anywhere to flee, the prince tried to send a drone with a message to explain the situation once again, but the machine was shot down and both fleets prepared for inevitable combat. But while Metzacans were outnumbered, they were most certainly not helpless. The prince addressed his soldiers once again, and as they prepared for battle, it was clear that they went a long way from their first days on the archipelago. Arius's company of retainers, some of which were veterans of old royal guard back on the old continent, prepared their enchanted, master-crafted weapons and armor, ready to push back any enemy foolish enough to come close. Mr. Storm gathered his students, each one on a flying mount, and at this point, all of them were powerful and experienced sorcerers in their own right, capable of amazing magical feats. Galadea snapped her fingers, and her shambling, hooded followers, clad in jet-black armor, crawled from below decks and readied their blades, each one dripping with poison so deadly that only undead could use it. Commander Tress lined up her ship with a battery of rapid-firing cannons, something she worked on together with Arcadian, and reinforced it with Tigran musketeers. And finally, dwarven sharpshooters readied sights on their breech-loaded rifles and prepared to snipe any officer they could see. And finally, from the dark beyond, Arcadian the Indomitable watched over the expedition as well, his weapons and armor now wielded by some of the most experienced soldiers in the land. Goblins might have had numbers, but exiles of Metzaca certainly had quality, and when the first shot of the battle was fired, no one could tell how it would go. Fortunately, while Republican fleet was larger, it was also divided into 2 groups, and one approaching from behind was much weaker than the main assault, and so as soon as Arius realized that, he ordered his forces to move back and deal with that flanking move, while drones rushed forward to distract and delay the main force. It seemed like an obvious strategy, and all that goblins had to do to counter it was to circle around and link up with the rest of their fleet, but for some reason they decided against that, and as first cannon rounds and spells were launched from Metzacan fleet, goblin reinforcements turned to face them. But this would not be a battle of broadsides, though thanks to Tigran fast-firing cannons they were still present, but of rapid, vicious boarding actions. Galadea and her shamblers took point, using their wyverns to charge at approaching ships, drop to the decks and, with support of Mr. Storm's magic, clear them out in a matter of minutes. Republican soldiers tried their best to resist, but they could do little against undead who could fall a dozen times and rise up every single time, before finally being so damaged to stop fighting. In the back line, Tigrans and Dwarves of Crimson Company provided fire support, with rifle and cannon rounds focusing any target that was close enough. The drones obviously charged mindlessly forward, and soon main goblin force was drowned in explosions, as these machines threw themselves at their targets without second thoughts. But while ships were most certainly vulnerable to such attacks, dragons were not, and very soon Tigran machines were taken out, and 2 massive creatures flew forward to drown their opponents in their poisonous breaths. By the time they did so though, the majority of their flanking force was already destroyed, but of course dragons cared little about it, and soon one of them flew closer to Arius's ship and engulfed it in a noxious cloud, similar to the ones that decimated Metzacan army when it fought undead dragons. But exactly because of that fight years ago, Prince Erigen and his men were prepared, and as soon as the beast flew closer, they all put masks made by Arcadian on, and simply weathered this attack without any issues, clearly confusing the dragon that was used to his attacks having a devastating effect on its targets. Such was its confusion that Prince's men were able to easily retaliate with their muskets, which almost made the creature fall into the waves. Meanwhile, the rest of Colonial fleet dealt with the remnants of the flanking force and prepared to receive the main attack, pulling back as far as they could to maximize efficiency of their guns, for the goblins were clearly more focused on boarding attacks and had very little means of actually striking Metzacans at a distance. Of course, they still had their second dragon, but as this flying monster moved in closer, it was focused down by every single gun in Arius's fleet, and its protective scales were knocked off one by one. A cannon round struck it right in the head, sending the confused creature reeling downwards, but mere seconds later Galadea arrived on her wyvern, and with full speed of her mount behind her, plunged her blade into exposed eye, which collapsed inside and erupted into a fountain of black blood. The necromancer kept pushing, and after another second her blade pierced Dragon's skull and embedded itself in its brain. She gave the sword one last push and turn and pulled it out, while the beast desperately tried to keep itself flying, but only managed to flap its wing once or twice before going limp and falling into the waves beneath it, disappearing within seconds. But before anyone in the fleet could even raise a cheer, their attention was turned to Arius's ship, where another dragon, brought low by constant gunfire, tried to swoop in on the deck, only to be repelled by another volley that made it fall into the waves. The beast tried to get back up, clawing at the ship, but to do so it had to place its head on the deck, which allowed Arius's men to rush in. Blades were raised and lowered, and few seconds later, Dragon's body fell into the ocean while its head, separated and bleeding, was kicked behind it moments later. Needless to say, such display of strength was enough to completely demoralize goblin forces, some of which simply turned around and ran away, but not all of them. One ship kept moving towards the fight even as other rounded goblin forces either surrendered or ran away, and as Commander Tress and Arius noticed by looking through their spyglasses, something on board of that ship was clearly wrong. The sailors there moved in stiff, mechanical manner, and as one of Metzacan's ships got closer, its crew noticed to their complete surprise that instead of being manned by living beings, it was instead being operated by a group of metal automatons. Such a thing was never seen before, but unfortunately these machines were clearly dangerous, for as soon as Prince's ships got in range they immediately found themselves under relentless volleys, which forced any boarding party to fall back or suffer heavy casualties, and soon Commander Tress simply ordered her gunners to focus their cannons on it, as it was one of the last remaining hostile vessels anyway, and send it to the bottom of the sea. Which happened soon enough, for as was said, by this time most of Republican fleet either surrendered, fled, or died. Soon, that last ship vanished beneath the waves, taking its mechanical crew down with it, and Metzacans remained last ones in the field, utterly surprised by their very low casualties. It was probably pointless to try to explain to goblins that it was all a misunderstanding, but Arius gave an order to fish out any survivors anyway, while, in the background, he also asked a certain skeleton to swim to the bottom of the ocean and see what this entire mechanical ship business was about.
Dragons. I knew republics could bring many things to this fight, but I've never expected them to tame actual dragons. Where the hell have they even found them? And how are we still alive?
It seems we're stronger than we thought. No wonder, we all have quite a lot of battles under our belts, though I have to say that if not for Commander Hackrench and her reinforcements, we probably would have ended at the bottom of the sea. But we did not, so our mission can continue. As soon as we're done gathering supplies from the wrecks, we should be good to go. Ah, and here's Manuel. Have you found the thing?
Sure thing, boss man. It was made out of metal, so it just went straight down after its ship sank. Found it stuck in the sand with some shark nibbling at its head, but I managed to chase it off. It's a bit heavy to get it out of the water, so I'm going to need some help.
Right away. You two, come with me. Let's throw this net down to Manny.
Right, now tie it there and... Come on lads, pull. There we go. Is this that machine that we saw on one of their ships?
It is. We had no chance to take a closer look at it, but Commander Tress observed it through her spyglass during the battle, and now that I see it up close I understand what she meant when she said it's more advanced than any other automaton. The fact that it survived falling to such depths is proof enough, but I was actually wondering something else. From what Tress said before, something that some of Goblin prisoners we caught after the battle confirmed, this machine is not actually controlled by someone else. It seems completely autonomous, and the goblins said that it was actually attached to them by Professor Plogvisher himself and served as a planning officer. It sounds completely unbelievable, especially now that it's damaged, but I'd like to see what make it tick.
This, an abomination, mechanical in life, Throw this thing overboard right away, Arius of House Erigen. Do not let this unfeeling metal corrupt you.
My apologies, Your Highness, but I must agree with Zabalus on this one. As you said yourself, we don't know what this thing really is, and we have no clue how it works. You say that it's broken, and it certainly is not moving, but I don't see any damage on it. What if it's still active and just waits to reactivate and attack us? Or what if it's loaded with explosives or poison? We should throw it overboard right away, just for our own safety.
Besides, do not forget that we are the only ones who can lead you to your destination, Arius of House Erigen. If you want to discard this abomination right away, you may forget about our guidance. I'm certain there are other, more understanding and responsible people around.
Yes, that's also a thing. But to be honest, you know I don't like agreeing with old Sparky here, but I think he may be right this time. Besides, just looking at this thing gives me the creeps. Its face is like one of those porcelain dolls that look almost lifelike, but some minor detail is always off and they just end up looking like they're straight from a horror story. And its glassy, empty eyes don't help either, so yeah, let's just toss it and move on. I'm sure we'll have plenty of interesting things to investigate once Zabalus delivers us to that starship, don't you think?
Very well, you're right, I'm sorry. I'm still shaken after that battle and elated that we mostly made it out okay with only minor casualties. It's clouded my judgment. Commander Tress, you are the one true artificer in our group, so I believe this thing falls under your jurisdiction. Please dispose of it, but do so in a way that it won't cause any harm to anyone. If this thing is a trap, we don't want it to blow up some random refugee.
Were you followed, Lord Arius?
I don't think so. Galadea is asleep, Zabalus is mumbling to herself in her cabin as usual, and Mr. Storm and his students are patrolling the skies looking for any trouble. We should have an hour or two. I assume everything went according to plan?
Almost, Lord Arius. I actually had to throw the automaton overboard, but I attached a small flotation device to it, so as soon as our nosy shadow guide was satisfied, I was able to bring it back to the surface, and my people brought it back on board.
Nice. You really are a great addition to the guild. Anyway, have you managed to investigate it?
A bit. I still had other things to do to avoid raising any suspicions. I managed to dismantle some parts of it, and I have to say, this craftsmanship is beyond anything I've ever seen.
Do you think it might have been made by these Commonwealth people?
No, it's not that advanced. Besides, some of the parts are marked with a sign of Republican colonies, so I believe this may be the project of their governor, that Professor Plogvisher. I heard about him back in the guild, and he was always described as one of the greatest artificers to ever live, so no wonder he could have made such a thing. Just look at it. Every part shifts seamlessly into other, which gives this machine ability to move as gracefully as my people. And it seems extremely resistant to damage as well. Took me well over an hour to even make a dent in this plate to get to its insides.
And yet it somehow doesn't seem to work right now, which makes no sense. Unless... Do you remember when Manuel said that a shark was trying to eat this thing? Why would an animal try to eat an automaton made out of metal?
No clue, but he said it was trying to get at its head, so maybe there's a clue there. Help me with this crowbar, we should be able to pull that plate away together. 1, 2, 3! What the? There's so much water, and is this a brain? So it would seem. Judging by its size and color, it's probably a goblin one.
So this thing is not actually a machine, it's a person stuck into a metal shell, and with all that water inside its body, they probably drowned. Damn it, it's fascinating, but it's not even remotely what I was looking for. If that was a real intelligent machine, we probably could have learned how to make them.
So that, should we fail in our mission, we could leave something behind, right? Something that would survive the coming cold.
Yes, but if it relies on actual body parts, then there's no way it would work. It would just freeze to death. Still, we should keep it around just in case. Maybe we can still learn something useful from it. But there's more to this entire situation. You were right, Commander Tress, about Zabalus and his effect on people. Normally, Mr. Storm would jump at an opportunity to research this machine no matter what. Same for Galadea, though she would probably try to turn it into some murderous monstrosity doing her bidding. The fact that they immediately told us to discard this thing as soon as Zabalus said so proves that you were right. we may be the only ones unaffected by this thing, Commander. So from now on, until we reach our destination, we must watch each other's backs. And once we arrive there, we may need to take the initiative and do what's best for the mission. After the battle was over, it did not take long for Erigen's company to revert to their previous state of internal paranoia. Before the sun set on that day, at least a dozen people accused others of selling out their location to goblin colonies, but Arius tried to silence such talks as quickly as he could. After all, they were now almost at their objective, and so any divide was unacceptable, especially since it was clear to everyone that goblins still had forces around and would not give away their position easily. For, as it happened, the starship that Arius tried to reach was located just off the shore of a massive coral city, originally inhabited by Nagas and conquered by the republics in previous years. In fact, some of the Nagas were even present in the battle and fought on Goblin's side, though they were clearly not happy about it. Sadly, with Republican troops still believing that this entire operation was an invasion, there was no way of convincing them to leave, and so, even though they just finished one battle, Arius and company had to prepare for another one. Sadly, materials needed to build more drones ran out, so Commander Tress could not create a distraction force. This would have to be a victory won by the expedition alone, but fortunately for them, the main force was already dealt with. On the other hand, goblins still had a sizable defense in the area, in form of Nagas, magical monsters, war machines, halfling flyers and riders, and, much to Metzacan dismay, yet another dragon. Arius tried to send an offer to negotiate, but halfling officer who commanded defenses in the area rejected it outright, and so the expedition was forced to disembark and move deeper inland to forcibly dislodge the defenders. But as they did so, they were quickly amazed by a sight no one has ever seen before. Mere kilometer beyond the usual-looking beach, there was a forest, but it quickly became clear that this place was built on triple the scale of usual one. Massive trees, wider than steam tanks and taller than greatest buildings towered over the area, casting dark shadows on the forest floor. But further, amongst and beyond the trees was something even more breathtaking, a series of colossal spires that snaked into the sky and glistened in the sun. The expedition noticed a lot of smaller ones closer to them, and quick investigation showed that their initial idea about them being made out of coral was wrong. For these spires turn out to be shells of massive, sedentary molluscoid creatures that burrowed deep underground to feed on whatever they could find there. As the creature grew, so did its shell, which served not only as protection, but as a balance counterweight, which allowed the mollusk to remain upright and grow deeper and deeper underground. Some of the shells, however, were empty, and in their hollow interiors Nagas made their living. A discovery that, in better times, would have brought thousands of scholars into the area, but now was barely a footnote in expedition's logs. They simply had no time to dwell on these massive creatures. They had to move deeper into the woods to find a place that Zabulus mentioned, and with every passing step, they were closer to the final goal. Finally, they reached it. A large, round, open clearing in the woods, where spiral shells and bones of some massive, long-dead creatures were arrayed in a circle. There, Zabulus pointed at one of the spires that loomed on the horizon and said that at its base was an entrance to their salvation. Rallied by these words, Arius and company entered the clearing, but as they did so, a vicious roar broke the silence, and a dragon flew from among the trees, followed by everything goblin defenders could muster. But while Metzacans were caught by surprise, they quickly shook it off and prepared for battle. Before the dragon could reach them, cannons were already ready to fire, and soon the forest erupted with sounds of gunfire and combat. Zabulus, for the first time, stepped forward and pointed its finger at the foes, causing clouds of angry insects to swarm and bite them, an attack that sounds a lot less dangerous than it really was, for it is one thing to try and hunt down one hornet, but completely different to try and fend off an entire swarm of them. The defenders, however, were not taking this lying down, and attacked with all they had. Their dragon proved to be especially troubling, as it flew above the entire field and swooped down upon Arius's company, scattering horses and men in all directions. With a swing of its tail it knocked the prince off his panther, and he flew several meters before smashing to the ground. Upon seeing that, his bodyguards rushed in and carried their commander away, despite his shouts to leave him, and fled deeper into the woods, leaving the rest of the battle to others. For the first time since he reached the archipelago, Arius Erigen was forced to flee, but his retainers were more than capable, and before the hour was over, Mr. Storm reported to his longtime student an absolute victory. Republican defenders were either dead or surrendered, but that still meant little, for as the old sorcerer noticed, the spires were still full of Nagas who, without a doubt, would use the opportunity to regain their freedom. It seemed that another fight was inevitable, but then Galadea arrived and said that slithering ones indeed came closer, but then they took one look at Zabulus and immediately surrendered themselves to the expedition. It was surprising, and a little concerning, but it also meant that all that Arius and his followers had to do now was to march a kilometer or two, and they would be at their destination. It was time to see if this entire starship business was really worth the effort. Look at this place. Look at the architecture, the edges, the materials. I can't even imagine how much work these snakes must have put into adapting these spires. I'm not an architect, but these things look like they should fall apart from a tiny gust of wind. We could spend months here unearthing all secrets of this place, and that's even without counting that buried starship nearby.
Indeed, but fascinating as this place is, we must not forget while we're here. First and foremost, learning about this place won't matter much, considering that it will soon disappear under ice and snow. And secondly, we don't have time for such research. If I'm thinking correctly, our work is still far from over.
I thought so too for a while, especially when I realized that Nagas controlled this place, but it seems that Zabulus already convinced them to abandon the republics and join us. I saw it talking to the remaining warriors after the battle, and they all just gather around it and seem to treat Zabulus with near religious reverence. From what it said later, it seems that the Nagas are going to help us with any issues we may have, so I'm not sure what worries you so much.
The state of our expedition, of course, and the fact that we haven't seen this starship yet.
True enough. Apparently there's a tunnel leading to it, as it is buried just off the shore. The Nagas are working to remove barricades they set up to prevent people from going there. Apparently it has some kind of mystical value to them. They call it Life Giver, and claim that it is the main reason why this area is so fertile and their towers so sturdy.
Then we'll see that soon enough. But as I said, there's another, far more important issue here. Look at our group. We're a band of less than 500 people. About 200 are humans, another 200 are Tigrans, and the rest are dwarves. And even if we manage to flee, is this enough to rebuild our civilization somewhere else? We're split mostly evenly when it comes to gender, so at least that's not that much of an issue, but we still may not have enough people to preserve us. What's more, we don't know how much such a journey to another world would take, and how are we supposed to survive it? And even if we somehow do, it leaves yet another issue, our professions. Some of us, like you, myself, my students, and some of the dwarves and Tigrans, have been educated on various topics. We have some engineers, alchemists, mages, and of course one artificer, but aside from that, the vast majority of people in our group are just soldiers. And as much as they are useful now, should we actually reach some other place, their contributions may not be needed anymore. And while we'll have plenty of veteran soldiers to protect our reborn society, we won't have anyone to actually rebuild it, or even feed it. We have no farmers, no ranchers, no blacksmiths or builders. We are a military force, and if we want to actually thrive out there, we need other people. People who can build instead of just fighting.
You're right. But at the same time we are fugitives, and until remnants of Republican forces return to their main force, no one will know we're here, unless Unless we use Commander Tress to help us. She already proved she can build drones, so we should be able to use them to inform other people of the archipelago about our plans. We could send them in all directions, with messages about our evacuation, and offer a place for everyone who shows up.
It could work, but first we actually need to see that starship. It may be that it can't actually hold that many people, and we'll be forced to leave some of us behind. Not to mention that sending such messages all across the archipelago would paint a target on us, especially now that Metzacan republics and Southern are all at war against each other. If they learn about potential way to flee the court here, we'll see armies knocking on our doors before this is done.
Hopefully the Nagas can help with that then. But you're right, we should at least take a look at this machine and see if it can actually hold more than just a handful of people. And by the looks of it, the Nagas are done in the tunnel, so let's go. Let's see that marvel of Commonwealth technology that is going to save our lives. Stars, take me, look at the size of this place. You could fit entire Metzacan and half of Sur Caris in this hangar. I can't even imagine how much work it took to build this place, especially since it's under the ocean. But look there, it must be that starship you mentioned, Zabulus. And I don't need to be an artificer to know that this thing is a wreck. How the hell is that pile of scrap supposed to get us anywhere?
Do not underestimate this machine, Fallen Prince. It is true that it suffered a lot of damage during its emergency landing, but said damage is only on the surface. All the important parts are working as intended. Can't you feel how warm this place is? It's the proof that heart of this vessel is still beating even after all this time. All you need to do is to use those crystal batteries you found to power it up, and it will be good to go. And worry not about external damage. We have talked to denizens of the spires, and they will eagerly help you to fix all of it.
If you say so. But I have to admit, I never expected this ship to be so large. It looks like it would fit tens of thousands of people.
More. So much more. It has been designed to establish colonies on distant worlds, and so is outfitted to bring populations of entire cities in one go. But we doubt that you will be able to gather so much, even if you decide to wait.
So you already know about Mr. Storm's reservations. Good. But no matter what, we must at least try and save as many people as we can, even if that means defending this place and fighting our own countrymen.
Your idealism will be your downfall, Arius of House Erigen. As long as we escape, your lives shall continue. But without us, you are doomed. But we will not force you, even though we really should.
That's nice of you, I guess. Besides, we still need to wait until this ship is patched up, so we won't be flying away anytime soon. Now come on, let's try to get inside. I think these doors there are open.
Warning. Shroud contamination detected. Initiating defensive lockdown.
Oh, they're not. And here I thought the hard part was already behind us.